Well, I don't need the fish anymore. Let's get rid of that. Okay. Oh, this is constantly comparing yourself to better people makes you self-disparaging, right? And constantly comparing yourself to worse people makes you, I thought I was going to say arrogant, but dismissive of others. That's kind of the same thing. Two negative things. So if you don't do either one, are you now going to be good? What's the flaw here?
It's essentially confusing necessary and sufficient.
Necessary and sufficient. It's basically saying, look, if you do A, then you're bad. And if you do B, then you're bad. So if you don't do either one, you're good. That's negating without switching, right? That's a false contrapositive. That's confusing necessary and sufficient conditions. That's saying that if the absence of this is the absence of that. Whereas really it should be the absence of bad means the absence of this. That would be a correct contrapositive. So I was expecting an answer choice that said confuses blah blah blah, but they didn't give that to us. Which answers were we debating?
D and E.
D and E.
D, E. Anything else? C. Okay. C. Takes for granted that, which means?
Assumes.
Necessarily assumes, right? So does this argument have to assume that if one is both dismissive of others and self-disparaging, one will not be self-accepting and accepting of others?
I think it does assume that.
Well, wait.
Because if it didn't assume that, then
you
the
can't
false
negate,
you
yeah.
could even start to make a false contrapositive because you'd be talking about two totally unrelated separate things.
So, actually, I don't think this is taken for granted because, it said that.
It's stating that, like it's not assuming that it's giving it as an.
Well, no, it says that if you're constantly comparing oneself to someone who's better than you, right?
Yep.
It leads to self-disparagement. So, okay. If you're both of these things,
It's the words for the most part, right?
one will not be self-accepting and accepting of others.
No, it's the for the most part, right? Because that says in most cases. But then there could be C is an absolute. The conclusion is for the most part. So you can do it sometimes, just not most of the time.
But that's for the most
No,
part refraining from
that's
comparing
referring to
yourself.
not whether you're self-accepting and accepting of others.
That it's almost invariably.
Okay, so when I first read this, I took this as a false contrapositive of what they were trying to claim. In other words, why, if you have either one of these characteristics, you will not be Okay, I still feel like it's not a necessary assumption because it's broadly talking about being dismissive and self-disparaging as opposed to being dismissive or self-disparaging in these circumstances when you're comparing yourself to other people.
So this one's saying either or.
Well,
What you would have to say
no,
either
like
or.
this answer choice is just a broad answer choice saying if you're both of these things, then you will not be self-accepting and accepting of others. But
the stimulus is saying either or.
well, it's saying that you have these characteristics under certain circumstances when you're comparing yourself to people who are better than you or people who are worse than you, and this is just a blanket statement.
So
Yeah.
wait, I am looking at this a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of assumed let's go with the author and forget the false contrapositives don't work. That's what he's trying to do. He's basically trying and failing to come up with a contrapositive.
Yes.
So in order for a contrapositive to even kind of start to work, you have to be negating. If you're not negating, then you can't even start to have a false contrapositive. You can't do anything because your statements are totally unlinked. So basically all this seems to be saying is that like a basic negation, like is like that he's making a negation here, or she's making a negation. Because if this isn't true, if C isn't true, then you can't, like, then you're basically saying that being accepting is not the negation of being dismissive, and being self-accepting is not the negation of being
Because basically answer choice C is saying the opposite of this. It's just going, it's a false contrapositive of this right here, right?
So
It's
you
saying
do a
if
false
you have this.
contrapositive, if you're not negating something, you can't even start to make anything that looks like a contrapositive. So you have to be negating something.
Wait,
Can you write
why
this
is
on
also
the board?
Does that make
also
sense?
why is C mutually exclusive from
Like-
what
Look,
they're
look, hold on one second. So, before we go down that road, let's talk about D really quick and get our minds wrapped around that.
Yeah.
So D says overlooks the possibility that self-disparagement and being dismissive of others can result from something other than comparing oneself to others. In other words, they said, look, if you don't do these two things, then you're going to be good, right? You're going to be self-accepting, you're going to be accepting of others. Well, maybe you could still be disparaging and dismissive of others for other reasons, right? That's the definition of a false contrapositive. Just because these two things lead to dismissiveness and disparagement does not mean that other things can't lead to dismissiveness and disparagement as well, right? So this argument is overlooking the possibility that something else, including not comparing yourself to others, could lead to a negative outcome, being dismissive or disparaging, right? So that's why answer choice D is correct.
I picked C as being wrong because they might be taking that for granted, but it's not a problem. It's not an issue.
It's almost like they're completely
Yeah.
complete contradictions of themselves.
Yeah.
Like, how can you be inherently dismissive and accepting at the same time? Like that's just something that you accept to be true, that you can't be those two things.
Yeah.
But I agree that
Like,
In order
I see what you're saying. They just have to, they
Yeah,
have
I
to
mean,
be
even-
believing. If you have both of these negative characteristics, then you can't
There's
have the
the
good
opposite.
characteristics.
I mean,
True.
because if there were a proper contrapositive, we'd be okay with the argument here, right?
Yeah.
And a proper contrapositive, you'd still have to assume C. Even for, like, you just have you couldn't have a proper contrapositive if C didn't work.
Wait, you don't need to assume that.
Because you wouldn't be able to flip and negate, because you wouldn't be able to negate, really.
Either way, it doesn't come back to comparing yourself to others because this is just comparing the negative characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do actually have to assume it for a lot of reasonable arguments that could be drawn from the premises. I just don't think it's a problem that you're assuming it, because, like, we assume stuff like this all the time, that, like, you know, there are opposites in the world.
Yeah, that's fair. What answers were we debating?
E.
E.
So I understand why D is correct, but I don't understand why E is wrong.
E takes for granted that whenever one compares oneself to others, one sees them as more successful and more able than oneself, or less successful and less able than oneself.
Because isn't that saying, like, if you're saying, like, A leads you to be bad and B leads you to be bad, isn't this answer saying that A leads you to be bad or something else? Like, there's, like, another arrow coming off A, and I don't understand why that's wrong.
Okay, so they did say that constantly comparing oneself to those one sees as more able or more successful almost invariably leads to self-disparagement. So when you compare yourself to those particular people that you see as more successful, then you're going to have this problem, right? And then the same is when you compare yourself to people you see as less successful. Answer choice E says, takes for granted that whenever one compares oneself to others, you're going to see yourself as better or worse. Do we have to make, the conclusion says, for those who for the most part refrain from comparing themselves to others, period.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the conclusion is just limiting itself to those people who don't compare themselves to others. But we have a whole other group of people, those people who compare themselves to others, but don't see those people as either better than themselves or worse than themselves.
Like just as good as.
But what? Yeah, like you can think about two categories. You either compare yourself to others or you don't, right? Those two groups.
Okay.
And the premises talk about
The
comparing
one-
yourself to others, right?
So the
And the
group that-
conclusion. Wait, what?
So the group, you said there's two groups of people. And
The-
they're talking about the group that compares themselves to others.
Well, they're talking about a subgroup of that.
Okay.
Because you have people who compare themselves to others, and then you have people who are not constantly comparing themselves to others,
Okay.
right? And maybe not comparing themselves at all. It says for those, for the most part, who refrain from comparing themselves to others. So you're just not making a comparison at all.
Okay.
Of the people, when you're talking about the people who are comparing themselves to others, they're specifically referring to a subset of those people. They're saying constantly comparing oneself to those one sees as more able or more successful. So you're only comparing yourself to those you see as more successful.
Okay.
Like you could compare yourself to someone
That I saw as an equal.
as an equal or, yeah.
Mhm.
And then they talk about constantly comparing oneself to those one sees as less able or less successful. So there's like this middle group that's not even discussed.
Right.
And so when answer choice E says, takes for granted that whenever one compares oneself, you either are going to see them as more successful or less successful, it's like, no, the argument just never even talked about this middle group. And the conclusion doesn't depend on that group existing or not existing, because it's just like, well, we're going to go focus on people who are not in the first two categories.
Okay.
But there could be this other group. So when it takes for granted that, it's, partly this is just word strength. Whenever you compare, you're going to see these two things. Well, no, it's open. It doesn't, it's not inconsistent with this argument for people to compare themselves to equals. We don't know what happens in that case. The argument doesn't talk about it at all. It only talks about people, the conclusion is only about people who, for the most part, don't compare themselves to others.
Okay. Got
Sound
it.
good?
Yeah.
All right, any other questions on that one? Okay.